Hi, and welcome back to part 3 of our series on authentication and authorization in ASP.NET Core. In today's video, we will learn about IDaaS, Identity as a Service, and why you might want to use one. We will also demonstrate how to connect multiple auth challenge or login providers so your users can choose which identity provider they want to use to log into your site. So stick around. In part 1 of our series, we learned about cookie-based authentication in ASP.NET Core and discussed the difference between authentication, authorization, and challenge. In part 2, we learned more about the challenge part of the authentication process and connected to a third-party OpenID provider, Google. There are many IDaaS providers such as Okta, Auth0, and Azure Active Directory, as well as self-hosted options such as Identity Server. We will be connecting to Okta and briefly look at some benefits of doing so. I have made sample code available on GitHub at github.com/mobiletoaster/authn. Additionally, I will be posting code and articles on my blog at mobiletoaster.com. IDaaS providers are different than social login providers like Facebook and Google. The IDaaS instances are yours, and you can add users to them just as you would if you had a table of users in your own system. But remember that a hosted provider has already taken care of the details such as encrypting the user's password or giving the user recovery options if they forget their username or password, and can provide multi-factor authentication tools such as SMS codes or even facial recognition with standards like FIDO. Most hosted providers offer a pretty generous free tier as well. Let's get started with Okta. So at developer.okta.com, I'm going to sign up and create a new account. And let's use Bob. So now they will have sent us an email. Click the activation link. Okay, now that we've registered for a developer account at Okta, I'm going to go ahead and sign in with the credentials that I used to create the account. Now this takes me to the dashboard, and your dashboard may look a little different. Okta is currently going through a redesign on their dashboard. So what I'm going to be doing is I'm going to go click on Applications, and I'm going to add an application. The developer account allows you to have up to 5 different applications registered before you need to pay. For what we're doing, this is good enough. I'm going to click Create a New App. And there are different types of apps you can create: web, native, single page, or OAuth service. We're going to do a web application using OpenID Connect. Now, I'm going to give this a name. We'll just call it Auth Sample App. I could add a logo or whatever, but I don't need to do that for now. So I'm just going to add this is important, our redirect URI. Now before, when we were connecting to Google, when we were listening on /auth for the callback, but if we add 2 of them, we can't have them both listening on /auth. So I'm going to be specific here and call this one Okta-auth. So now that we've created our application, it's given us a client ID and a client secret. This is the domain that we have assigned to us. With a paid account, I believe you can put a custom domain on this, and maybe you can't even with the free account, I'm not sure. But this will be good enough for what we're trying to do. There are different grant types that we can use. We could do a client credentials grant, or an authorization code flow, or an implicit /hybrid flow, but for what our application is using, we're going to use the authorization code flow, or that type of a grant. The checkbox for required consent is checked, and here's our callback, our login redirect URI, Okta-auth that we just set up on the previous screen. I'm not going to change anything. Everything here looks really good, but I need to grab the client ID, the client secret, and the Okta domain. It's time to return to our application, and we're going to go back to our auth sample application into the startup. And before, where we had OpenID Connect Google Register, I've changed it to be a lowercase g for Google, and this will make more sense later why I did that. But we're going to add a new one, and I'm going to specifically call it Okta with lowercase. And we're going to just set this up with the authority. And the authority is the domain, which is this domain right here. So we'll set that up. And then we need a client ID. I believe this is the client ID. And we need the client secret. And that should be the client secret. We need a callback path. And we set it up to be Okta/auth. So now that we have two OpenID Connect providers registered, Google and Okta, we need to now change the authentication default challenge scheme. For now, I'm going to just switch to Okta. We'll change this in a moment. If I don't switch it to Okta, it's going to automatically redirect to Google for sign-in. Let's just run this and see how far we get. So I click on secured. It should now redirect me. Uh-oh, we have a problem. The response type is not supported by the authorization server. Configured response types code error URI. Okay, this makes sense. I think one of the most frustrating parts of OpenID Connect is that developers often find that different providers implement different parts of the specification. So it makes it a little bit challenging sometimes to discover what options you need to turn on for which different providers. And this is really just, there's not a lot you can do about it. You just need to understand how each of the different providers are expecting their configuration to be set up. So Okta requires that we set the response type, and we want the response type to be code. Now, there are some constants that you can use, but sometimes I think it's harder to remember that. But it's OpenID Connect response type dot code. And if you hover over that, you can see it's a constant that is equivalent to the word code. So in this case, I know it's probably better to use constants, but I can spell code. It's 4 letters. Hopefully I get that right. Let's run this and see if that makes things better. Okay, so this is an interesting error. It says OpenID Connect protocol exception, message contains error, access denied. Error description is the user is not assigned to the client application. All right, well, what does that mean? Well, this is actually kind of an interesting error. So if we head back to our Okta dashboard, let's take a look and see what that means. So we've created an application called AuthSample app. But if we look at assignments, we'll see that no people are assigned to use this application. This is one of the reasons I wanted to demonstrate using an IDP such as Okta or Auth0 or even Active Directory. They behave a little bit differently than Google, Facebook, and Twitter. With Google, Facebook, and Twitter, you don't have any control over the user in the IDP. But here you do, because this is your space, your tenant in the Okta IDP. I have the rights to assign people to applications, or I can assign groups to applications or whatever. So if I go in here and click assign, I can assign this application to people, and here's Bob. So now if I assign Bob, now Bob is assigned to this application. If we return to our application and we try to go through the sign-in process again, click on secured, redirects. Okay, so now it made it all the way through and we are logged in, but we've hit our denied URL. So now that he has rights to our application according to Okta, the next thing we need to figure out is why doesn't he have rights to this particular page? Now, if you recall, this authorized attribute over the secured endpoint requires a role of admin, and we haven't really given him a way to be an admin. Let's take off that requirement that you have to be an admin for the time being, and let's just mark it with authorize, rerun the application, and see if our authentication is working the way we think it should be. Okay, so now we're logged in as Bob, and because it doesn't require us to be an admin for the time being, it's allowing us to get in here, and this looks pretty good. Here's his name identifier, and this is the unique ID that a user gets assigned in Okta. So when a new user signs up and adds himself to our space in Okta, they're automatically given a unique key that represents them. His name is Bob Coder, his preferred username is bob@admonix.com, and that's his auth time. Some pretty basic stuff there, and that looks pretty good. So if you recall what we had to do with Google, remember we had to attach ourselves to the onTokenValidated event, and we had to look at his claims to see if his claim, his name identifier, his unique ID in Google, which was this, then we knew it was Bob, and if it was Bob coming in, we'd create a new claim of type role and make him an admin and add that to his list of claims. That happened during the onTokenValidated event for Google. Now we could go and do the same thing with Okta, so we'd have to look for this name identifier in the case of Okta to know that it's Bob coming in. But when you're working with an IDP like Okta or Auth0 or Active Directory, you have some other options here, and that's kind of what we want to look at next, is some different ways to identify that Bob is an admin, or in this case belongs to an admin group. Returning to our Okta dashboard, remember we said we could assign groups? Right now we have two different groups set up. I created one earlier called admin or administrator group, and then an everyone group. What we could have done is, rather than individually assign Bob access to this application, by default he's in the everyone group. I could have just assigned the everyone group to this application, and then anybody who's in that group would automatically be able to use that. But I want to assign the administrator group rights to use this application, and I think I'll go ahead and assign the everyone group too while we're at it. So now we have two different groups here that are assigned to use this application. Let's go take a look at the admin group itself. Who's in the admin group? Well, I'd already added Bob to the admin group. Now, how do we know that he's in the admin group? That's the next thing we need to figure out. Back of the dashboard, I'm going to go down to security, and I'm going to select API. Now, if you don't have this API option, you may need to go to your settings and go to features and check app configuration API access. Now with that checked, I should be able to go to security and select API. So now we're looking at authorization servers. We have one that's predefined for us, this default authorization server. Let's go in here, and what we want to do is add a claim. So let's add a specific claim, and I'm going to call this roles, and I want this to be in the ID token always, and we're going to use groups, and we can use starts with equals contains, but in this case I just want to include a regex pattern .star and include this in any scope. Now once I do this, I have this new claim type of roles that matches this regex pattern based on groups that the user belongs to. So if I go look at the token preview now, this is kind of a cool little tool that they give you. So I find my app, the auth sample app. We're using authorization code, and I look for a specific user, in this case Bob. He's the only one we have, so. And then I choose the OpenID scope to preview the token. And this shows me what the token is going to look like. And you'll notice in here, there is a new claim in here for roles. And since Bob belongs to the everyone group, and I've added him to the admin group, both of those show up as roles. This is pretty exciting. Let's go to our application and run this and see if now when we log in as Bob, he gets new claims added to his token. Click Secured. Okay, we've made it all the way through and we've signed in, but I don't see any new claims in here for the roles that we added. Something's missing. Sorry to disappoint you. It didn't work. Let's see if we can fix this. If we go back and look at the dashboard for a minute, one thing that you'll notice is that the issuer URI has changed slightly. Before, when we put in our authority, we only put https dev-whatever okta.com/ but notice it has OAuth2/default on here now. I'm going to copy this and come back to our code and change the authority to this new address, which helps our application talk directly to that authorization server. Let's run this again and see if that fixes things. Let's try this. Click Secured, sign in as Bob, return to the app, and notice magically we have two new claims there. They're of type role, and it has declared him as having the claim for everyone role and admin role. That's pretty cool. So now that this role has showed up, we should be able to go back in our application to our HomeController and re-add the authorization with roles equals admin, and our application should still work. And it let us through this time, and we still see that all of his information. So it is working now, even with our authorized route requiring an admin role. In just a few minutes, we provisioned a new Okta account, designated a new application in Okta, implemented the credentials in our app, including using group assignments as a custom role claim in our ID token. Right now, our application is only using Okta as a sign-in option, even though we have also registered Google as an IDP with our application. The next step will be to allow a user to select which way he wants to log in. Back in our code, let's return to our Startup.cs file. If you recall, on line 37, we changed the default challenge scheme from Google to Okta. But what we really want to do here is change this to be Cookie Authentication Defaults Authentication Scheme. And what that's going to do is whenever there's an opportunity for a challenge to happen or we need to prompt the user for credentials, rather than automatically going to either Google or Okta or Facebook or Twitter or GitHub or whichever providers we add, what we're going to do is we're going to say, hey, the user needs to log in. We need to challenge them. Where should we go? We've said, Cookie, you're in charge of that. And Cookie says, oh, I'm going to take them to a route/login. Let's go to the HomeController and look at that route for login. So the route login will return a view for login. Let's go look at the view under Home, Login CSHTML. The Login CSHTML page has a form on it that accepts a username and a password and a submit button. We created this form during the first video that we recorded on Cookie Authentication, where we made a custom login screen. We need to add some links to this custom login screen, giving the user an option to log into Google or Okta, in addition to logging in with the username and password. Okay, I've added these links. You can see I have an href, Google, Okta, with the return URL, login with Google, login with Okta. If we look in the HomeController, I've already written some code here for login/Google that would accept Google's a return URL in the Google action method here, and it would call the challenge async Google authentication properties, configure await false, etc., etc. However, I don't really want to use this code this way. I mean, what I could do is I could make a copy of this, and I could paste this, and I could have an entry here for Okta, make all the changes for login Okta, and so on and so forth. But if I were to add a whole bunch of providers, this could get pretty repetitive. So let's see if there's a better way to do this. I'm going to undo these changes here. And although I want to follow this particular pattern, let's make it a little more generic. In here, I'm going to put curly brace provider curly brace. And I'm just going to change this to be generic login external. And then the string that comes in for the return URL is going to come from the query string, but we'll also get the provider from the route. Now, technically, if I wanted to be explicit, I could add things like this comes from the route, and this comes from the query, and that would be okay to do. But the model binder in ASP.NET Core is really pretty good. It will look to find a match, and it just works anyway. I'm going to leave that in there for now, just to make it clear where these are coming from. I'll leave this in here that says if we already have a user that's logged in, then there's no point of taking them to a login, just take them home. Here's the return URL string, is null or empty return URL. In other words, if we don't have a return URL passed to us, then designate the slash, which is representative of the home page, as the return URL. Otherwise, take the return URL. And then we need these authentication properties where we pass the redirect URI in as the return URL. Finally, in our previous video, we used the await HTTP context challenge async, passing in the name of the scheme Google and the authentication properties to perform the challenge and to redirect to Google's login page. But obviously in this case, we don't want to pass Google. We want to pass the provider. That way, if it's Okta, it will call the challenge async portion from Okta versus the challenge async method for Google. Now, there's something else we can do here. I wanted to show using the HTTP contents challenge async last time, but I think this time I want to show something a little bit different. There is an alternative. We can return a new challenge result, and that challenge result has 6 overloads. One that takes authentication properties, one that takes the names of the scheme, one that takes a list of schemes, or authentication scheme, comma, properties. And that's the one I want to use. Provider authentication properties. Now notice there's no await or anything like that. It should just work. Except we need to change this to be return. And I don't think it needs to be async anymore. action result. So we don't need to use this. I think that should work. I think I want to run this. Let's see what happens. So now we have our login page. We can use a username and a password and sign in, or we can log in with Google or Okta. So let's start with Google. Now it redirected me to Google's login page, and I'm going to log in as Bob Tester. And now I'm logged in. So let's log out again. And this time I'm going to click Secured, and I'm going to select Login with Okta. Now it redirects me to the Okta login page, and I'm going to sign in as Bob Coder. And sure enough, this time we're Bob Coder, not Bob Tester, and we're logged in, and we have our admin and everyone roles. So that's pretty cool. That was pretty easy to connect. Now, one thing I noticed is when I clicked Logout, it took me to the Google Logout page, even when I was logged into Okta. We should probably fix that. So let's take a look at our logout code. Currently, this is the logout code we have. We call await HTTP context.signoutAsync and return redirect to this Google page. And it has to be this way, unfortunately, because Google uses a unique way to log out. If you actually want to log out of their app engine, you have to call this redirect. So I guess the big problem here is that even though we can call logout, we really don't know at this point what challenge scheme was used by the user or which identity provider they selected when they logged in. We really need to know that so that when they log out, we choose the correct logout method. I looked around a little bit to see if there was an easy way to discover which challenge scheme was used when a user logged in, and there really isn't. Let's just take matters into our own hands. So let's go back to Startup, and we'll look at our authentication setup here. So we know we have events, in OpenID Connect that we can hook into. We're already connecting into the onTokenValidated event for Google. So let's put a breakpoint in here and just see what other information we have available at this point in time. I'm going to choose Google so that we land in that. So if we inspect the context, and if we scroll down, there is a scheme here. And if we inspect the scheme, it gives us the name of the scheme that's being used, which is Google, which would make sense because we're inside the OpenID Connect Google handler. So that's one way we could do it. We can check to see if the scheme is Google. And if it is, we can add a claim that says scheme and the name of the scheme, Google, and add that to as a property for the user who's signed in. Then we know whether he signed in with Google or Okta, or if he just signed in with Cookie Authentication. So that would work, and we would have to add that for every OpenID Connect provider we attached. But I'm wondering if we could take advantage of the second phase of events inside of the add cookie option. So let's take a look in here. Do events equals new cookie authentication events. And the event that I'm going to be caring about, I think, is on signing in, during the signing in process. It's a two-step process. Remember, once add OpenID Connect is completed, it will call and fire the on signing in event of the cookie authentication handler. So we'll demonstrate this. And we'll put a breakpoint in here and say scheme equals context.scheme, and we'll see what we get here. Okay, we've hit the first breakpoint. I'm going to continue on, hit the second breakpoint, inspect the scheme. This time it said cookies. So scheme probably isn't going to help us inside of cookies during the on signing in event. However, I do know that there's this thing called authentication properties. And if we look in the items instead of authentication properties, you'll notice that this authentication scheme, it says Google right there. And I think we can use that to our advantage. So let's write a little bit of code here that fixes this. So we want to be in context.properties, which is authentication properties, and there's a list of items, and we want the item where the key is equal to, and if you were paying attention, I believe it starts with .AuthScheme, and we'll just say the first or default. Okay, I'm going to take this breakpoint off, and we'll run it through. Okay, we hit the second breakpoint, and this time we got the key value pair back, .AuthScheme, and the value is Google. Now let's test that if we were to go ahead and log out of Google this time. Click this again, and let's sign in with Okta. Now if I check the scheme, it says .AuthScheme is Okta. So we have one more we want to check. And our logout still isn't correct because it's taking us back to Google, but now I'm going to use, so it's Bob, not Blob. Let's try this again. It's Bob and pizza. Okay, so we're signing in, and this time the scheme is null, null. Interesting. So if we look under properties, what do we see? 2 items, an issued and expires. Okay. So we could look for null null and know that that was the built-in authentication. I think we can fix this by going into the HomeController and going to our validate event where we validate the username and password. And there's an overload for sign-in async that accepts something called an authentication properties. So we're going to add something there. Let's call var properties equals new authentication properties. And we'll put properties here. Now, authentication properties has a couple of overloads. Let's see what they are. Dictionary of string for items. So we'll want to create a new items equals new dictionary of string, comma string. And then we'll say item. Oh, did I say item? I want items. Items dot add. And then we'll do the key being AuthScheme. And the value will be Cookie Authentication defaults.authentication scheme. Put that in there. So we'll pass items into our new authentication properties, and we'll pass properties into sign-in async. So a few extra steps there. But basically what this is going to do is it's going to add an entry for .authScheme, and the entry will be this constant, which is cookies, and we'll put it inside of the authentication properties, and that should properly pass that all the way through from our challenge. This is kind of our challenge, local challenge scheme. And when it calls sign-in async, it should land inside of our startup for cookies. So we'll watch this in action. Pizza. And now we have a scheme there, because if we look in the items, there's 3 items, and we've added this .authScheme and cookies. So that should take care of our 3 different scenarios: Google, Okta, and cookies. Now that we have our AuthScheme passing all the way through, we need to add that as a claim so that it is part of that user's identity. Let's steal some of this code here and replicate it up here. And what I'm going to do is we're not going to add this as a type. We're going to call this scheme.key, comma, scheme.value. And then we'll add that to the claim, and that should add it to our identity. So let's see if that works. So that works. We now have an additional claim property for a .authScheme, and the value is Okta. I believe we have everything in place now to go and fix the logout process. So let's go to HomeControllers, and let's go to our logout code. Currently, this is what it looks like. It's a simple sign out, but let's see if we can fix this up. So the first thing I want to do is I want to know what scheme was used. So let's see if we can figure that out. I think the easiest way to do that is go to the user.claims.first or default, where the claim type is going to be equal to .authScheme. That's what we're looking for. And we'll get the value out from there. Value. Let's try that again. Okay, we got that. Let's run it to this point and see if we get that value back. This time I'm going to use Google. Now when I press the logout button, did we pick up the scheme? And it says the scheme is Google. So I think we're good there. We now know the scheme that was used to sign in. Because Google is a little bit different, I'm going to check to see if our scheme was Google. If it is, then this is the way we want to perform the logout. And Google's a little bit different because you have to redirect to this location if you want to log out of your Google account and not just out of your application. But for everything else, we're going to do it this other way. You sign out result. There it is. And this sign out result takes a number of different overloads, but the one that I'm interested in is the list of authentication schemes. So I'm going to try and do this inline. We'll just do a new array. And the two schemes are cookie authentication defaults dot authentication scheme, and the other one is the scheme that was passed through, or the scheme that the user signed in with during the challenge step. We want to sign out of both of those so that we sign out of our application and out of the identity provider. And we just want to return that. And I think that should take care of it. There are a couple more things we need to do. If we go back to our startup, we need to add a couple of things here. So we have an option for the callback path. And you'll notice there's two callback paths. There's also one for the signed out callback path. And I want to make this one Okta-sign out. It can be anything we want. By default, it is something like sign out callback OIDC or something like that. But since we have multiple providers, it's best if we are specific about our callback. And the other thing we're going to need, and I was debated whether to put this in and just run it and find the error, but let's just go ahead and put this in and save ourselves some time. We will need to save the token. The reason that is during the logout process, Okta needs to sign out using the token. So we will actually be sending the token back to Okta to sign out. Now, we won't actually have to do any of this. The framework will take care of all of this for us, but that is a requirement that they send the token back. And it's kind of all built into OpenID Connect and their protocol. So finally, we need to go back to the Okta dashboard, go back to Applications, click on our Auth sample app. And in the General Settings section here, you'll notice that we have a login redirect URI, but we didn't specify a logout redirect URI or the location to return to after Okta is done doing the logout process. So I'm going to click Edit, and I'm going to add a logout URI. And this needs to be our Okta-sign out that we registered with the middleware, or with the handler, I should say. This means when Okta is done signing out, it will return to this location to complete the process. Now let's run it and see if all of this works. Log in with Okta. Sign in. Now click Logout. And it redirected all the way back, and we are logged out again. So let's take a peek and see if we can see what happened. I'm on the Network tab here. I'm going to go and log out. And we'll watch all the steps. So as part of the logout process, it's kind of long here, but the most important part of this URL is if you look at the ID token underscore hint equals, and then the token gets embedded in that URL and sent back to Okta. That is what they need to be able to sign the user out of Okta and then return back to us. One final piece I wanted to show are a couple of settings that we didn't explicitly set, but you can, and that is the ability to add specific scopes. Now, we didn't add these because the handler actually by default includes both OpenID and profile as scopes to send off to Okta or to every OpenID provider. Since this is a generic OpenID Connect handler, by default, there are two scopes that are automatically added, and we don't need to specifically add those and send those, but in this particular case. But if you do want to add other scopes, for instance, with Okta, you can ask for a refresh token by sending the scope of offline access, I believe. By adding that scope, they will also return a refresh token to you as well as the ID token and an access token. We've just scratched the surface of what is possible with a hosted identity provider like Okta. When would you use a hosted provider like Okta or Azure Directory? Well, you can use it in many ways. For example, if you were building a system for a small company and they wanted to manage their accounts for HR purposes, like when a new person is hired or another person leaves employment, hosted solutions are great. You don't have to build it yourself, but you still have control over the attributes of the user's identity. Once you have your environment set up, you can use tools like Terraform to make it easy to transform your development environment to look the same for other developer accounts, and even preload it with test users, etc. Maybe your organization already has a Terraform script to accomplish just this. For the next section of this tutorial, I wanted to move away from the hosted identity concept and build out the application to really support social identity providers like Google, Facebook, Twitter, etc., and demonstrate how we can allow new users to register with our application so we can remember them on subsequent visits. I've made a couple of changes. I've taken out the hard-coded authority, client ID, secret, etc., and I've moved those to my secrets.json file to keep them protected. I did this so I could add it to source control on GitHub to make the project available to you. You will find the project on GitHub at github.com/mobiletoaster/authn. Next, I added a SQLite database file locally in the project to simulate a hosted database like SQL Azure without having to set one up. It makes it easier for you to use when you download the project from GitHub. To learn more about how I added the SQLite database using Entity Framework Code First, you can click the link to go watch my Code Hack Moment video showing the setup. You'll notice we have a data folder, and inside of our data folder we have an appdb, app users, an authDB context, and some migration code for the snapshot and the initial. Now that we have an app database created for our application, I want to add some services so that we can write common functions to interact with it. I'm going to add a new folder so I can place all my services in here. And let's go ahead and add a class. I'm going to call this the user service. Okay, and let's go ahead and create a constructor for it. And let's add a private read-only. I'm going to need access to the database context. And I'll just call it context, since we only have one. And we'll need to get that handed to us through the dependency injection system. And then we'll assign the variable the incoming. So that looks pretty good. So the first thing we want to do is be able to look up a user by either their ID or by their external provider. So we could do something like this, and maybe we'll make these internal. So internal app user, get user by external provider. I'm going to pass in the name of the provider, be it Okta or Google. And then I'm going to have the name identifier passed in, or their unique ID from each of those providers. Then I'll look in our context, and in our app users, and I'm going to look for where an app user has a provider equal to the incoming provider that we're asking about. And then we'll have where the name identifier equals the name identifier. And then we'll take the first or default. And then we'll return app user. So we could do that all in one line, but I may want to add some other things later, so keep it separate for now. And then within our system, we have our own surrogate key or an ID that's just an integer base from 1 to infinity. Well, infinity is a little high. 1 to some really large number. And I may want to look up the user by that internal ID that we assign them once they get added into our system. And for this, I'm just going to use a find. So this will work for our external providers like Google, Facebook, Okta, Twitter, etc. Get user by ID will let us look up users that are internal, that have been already registered or joined our system. And then finally, if someone created their own custom username and password with our local system, we need a way to do the validate event. If you look in our HomeController right now, in our validate event, we're literally just doing a hard code and we're only looking for one user named Bob. So we want to change this to be driven from the database instead. So for this, I'm going to return a Boolean. I'm going to call it a TryValidateUser. So we're going to create a try pattern that returns a Boolean, and well, just follow me along here. This will make sense. So we'll pass the username and password in, and then we'll pass back a list of claims. Our out variable is going to be just a list of claims if we find a match. So the first thing I'm going to do is initialize claims. Oops. First thing I'm going to do is initialize claims. Next thing I'm going to do is try to find a matching app user. Now, there's a couple different ways we could do this, but I think this one will make sense, and I think you'll be able to follow along here and follow my crazy train of thought. So I'm adding two where clauses to this link statement. Basically, we're going to look in our list of users, and if we have a user that matches the username and password that we're looking for, we'll grab it as first or default. Now, if there's no match, for instance, if the user puts the wrong username and password combination in there, app user should come back null. So if app user is null, then we're just going to return false, and we're not going to do anything else. But if we do get a match, that means they put the right username and password combination in, and we have an app user back, then we're going to add a bunch of claims. And this could take a minute, so maybe I'll just paste these in. So we're adding a name identifier, a username, a claim for given name, surname, email, mobile phone. Okay, and then I also want to add this section in here to loop through a role list and add a role claim for each role in the user's role list. Now let's look at this real quickly. The role list is a get method that returns this from the string roles, which is a common delimited list of string values for roles or names, and we split those and turn them into a list of strings instead. From the database, we can add a comma delimited list of roles, pull them back out, and split those into a list of string. What that allows us to do is in here to loop through each one of those and add them as an individual claim role type for the user. Then finally, we need to return true. Now that we have our TryValidateUser in the user service ready to go, we need to go connect that in the HomeController. If we look in the HomeController under the validate event, we still have this hard-coded username and password check. And we really want to get away from that and use our new service method to look it up in the database instead. Before we can do that, though, we need to add a reference to the service. And we're going to use dependency injection to put this in. And I don't have time to go into details about the dependency injection system and how it works, but we will just use it, and maybe in a future video we'll do a deep dive into that. Okay, so now I've connected the user service and I can use it down below. So user service, and we'll call our new TryValidateUser, and what does it need? Use a username and a password, and if it's successful, if it's true, then I'm going to get back a list of claim, and we'll call that claims. So out of this, we can now eliminate all of this stuff in here, because that's all encapsulated in our TryValidate, but we will need this other part. So we'll paste that up in there. We can get rid of this whole big block. And we can have an else block. And in the else block, we can return our error, letting the user know that something didn't go right with the username or password. Okay, so this should work. Let's take a look and see if that's the case. And this is the error we get: unable to resolve service for user service while attempting to activate the HomeController. And it says right here, dependency injection. You didn't set this up. And it's right, we didn't. So let's go do that. If we go to the startup, and we go to the configure services section, where do we want to put this? How about right here? And I'm going to add this as scoped. And we'll go user service. Okay, so now that we've registered it with the DI system, it should be able to successfully hand that to us when we launch the HomeController. Let's try it again. Put Bob and pizza in, and voila, it took it this time. And this time it was driven from the database. And the user comes back as Bob Tester, and we have a phone number here for mobile phone, email address, and we've picked up his role of admin, and this was performed through the authentication scheme called cookies. So this looks great. We're doing fantastic. We need to turn our attention to our social providers. If we go into the startup, if we examine Google, we have a hard-coded entry to make Bob an admin. Instead, we want to get that from the database, so let's remove our hard-coded entry. We won't be needing these events, so let's get rid of it, because we'll want to use the on-signing-in event instead. We need to get the user's name identifier, his name ID, from the claims identity as it's constructed so far. And pairing that with the AuthScheme used, check the database to see if we have a user entry. This means we will need access to the user service from the dependency injection system. To get it, we can use a method on the context. So I'm going to have a var user service variable, call the context HTTP context, request services, get required service, and it wants a type, so we'll say type of user service, and we'll cast this as a user service. We also need to grab the name identifier from the claims identity. I probably should put some checks in here. If user service not equal to null, name identifier is not equal to null. Okay, and then what we want to do is say var, let's see if we can get an app user from the database using our user service and using our method getUser by external provider. And for the provider, we'll use the scheme and the name identifier, and we'll see if we get a value back. So we'll do scheme and the value, the name identifier, and see if we get an app user back. I say we put a breakpoint here, and we run it to this point and see what we get. Actually, let's put a breakpoint here, and we'll step through. Start with Google. Okay, now we'll come back here and let's see what we get. We have this object for scheme that shows that the value is Google. We get our claims identity, and we should get access to the user service, which we do. Name identifier, and that's the name identifier for Bob. So we have both the user service and the name identifier. And if we call to the database, our app user is null because we don't have an entry for him in the database. But if we did, it would have found him and that would be good. So we're on our way. Let's create an add new user method in our user service so we can add them to our database the first time they log in with our system. Let's go to user service, and we'll continue on. Internal, and once we add them, we'll return them as an app user. We'll call it add new user, and we will need, first we'll need to know the provider, and then let's bring in all of their claims. So we'll create an app user. And now the mundane effort of mapping all the properties. So let's start with name identifier. We have to go to our list of claims. Get the first or default. I'll use C this time. And then we assign it. This could get tedious. I want to write an extension method to make this a little bit better. Now an extension method needs to be in a public static class. And I'll just call this extensions and put it here locally. Not best practice, but this should demonstrate what I'm trying to accomplish. And we'll public static string get claim from this is this secret keyword. And the name of the property. And we'll just say return claims.first or default. Type equals name question mark dot value. So now if I come up here and I say app user dot username, for instance, I can say claims dot get claim, and the name is going to be username. And that's much shorter than what this is up here. So let's redo this one. And we can get rid of this. That's a little cleaner. And I'm going to go ahead and do the rest of these. Okay, so I've finished typing these out. There's one more property I need to assign, and I'm going to put that at the top because we want to make sure we pass the provider in and assign that. Okay, now that we have all of our properties filled up, we need to go to the context dot app users, and then we're going to just do an add this new app user. And that add will return an entity. So let's grab the entity that comes back. Then we'll need to call context.saveChanges. And then we want to return the entity.entity. All right, so that should be our add new user. We'll construct the user, fill his properties out, add him to the app user's context, save those changes, which will commit him to the database, and then we will get back a new version of the entity that will have the user ID surrogate value populated because we're not sending one in. The database will automatically increment that and assign that, and we'll have that back. And we will return it and use it. Let's go back to startup and let's connect this. So if our app user is null, let's call our user service. So I'm going to add a new user, and let's pass in our provider, which is located in our scheme.value. And then our claims, identity.claims. We'll pass those in. And what we'll get out of here is a new app user. So let's just reassign app user equal to that. It's an IEnumerable, so let's just make it a list. So the last thing we want to do in here is grab the role list from the user, and I recognize that if we're just adding a new user, he won't have any roles added to his account. We're going to take the claims identity as it's built to this point, and we're going to use the add claim method to add a new claim, claim types.role, and I'm going to add R to that list. So then basically what this is saying is we'll go in here and try to find a user in the database. If he exists, then we'll just drop down to this section and pull out his claims, specifically pull out his roles, loop through those roles, and add a claim for his role. If the user doesn't exist, we'll add him first to the database. He won't have any roles, so we won't have anything to loop over, but the next time he logs in, if someone's gone in and assigned him some roles, then we'll have that data. And before we run that, let's take a look in our database. So I'm using SQLite browser to look at this. Apparently there's a new version. So if we look at our app users table, we have one app user so far. This is the Bob Pizza user, and the provider is Cookies. And the user ID is 1. He doesn't have a name identifier because he's a local account and not an external account. So when we run this, we'll watch and see what happens to our database. Click secured. This time we'll log in with Google again. And we had an error. So we'll do roles split to list, and if it's null, then we'll return a new list of string. It didn't account for that situation. He should get a permission denied because he doesn't have any roles. So if we go back to our database, and if I hit refresh, you'll see we now have a second provider in here, and it's Google with his name identifier, and his first name is Bob, last name is Tester, and he has no roles. So if we were to go in here and give him an admin role, and then we have to write those changes to the database, come back to our application, log out, and log back in. And it lets us through. So if we were to repeat the process with Okta, you should get an access denied. Go back to our database, hit refresh. Now we have an entry for Okta. Didn't pick up his first name and last name for some reason. We'll have to take a look at that and see why Okta is not sending this. But I'll write those changes. We'll come back. We'll have to log out, log back in, log in with Okta. So this time we got the app user back, but for some reason the app user has no first name or last name. So let's look at the claims that are coming in for him. They have a name field for Bob Coder, and they don't specify a first name and a last name, so they only support a name field, which kind of stinks. Let's go back and fix that. In our add new user, first name, last name, if app user.firstname, if string.is null or empty, first name, then let's go to this claim. Actually, so let's just do it this way. So then we'll just say app user.firstname equals this. So we'll just shove it in the first name field for now. We could do more to clean that up, but I think that's good enough. So what I'm going to do then is, let's delete this record, write those changes, come back in, we'll run it again. Log in with Okta, And if we go back to our database, hit refresh, now we have an entry from Okta, and we just shoved Bob Coder into the first name field. Now, there are other ways we could probably do this with Okta. We could go and get a separate first name and last name by going and tweaking his token, as we showed earlier, but for now, that's good. I'm going to type in admin, and then I'm going to write those changes. Now, if I log out, and I log back in with Okta, and voila, we are in, and he has a couple of claims. He's in the everyone role, and now he has the admin role because I added it. We've covered a lot in this video. I hope you found it useful. We connected to a cloud-hosted identity as a service provider in Okta. We learned about how our Okta tenant is ours to manage and configure with users and groups. We learned how to connect multiple providers as challenge schemes and give the user a choice of different social login providers. We learned how to connect to a local SQLite database to add our users as they log in to a social identity provider, which, by the way, you should replace with something like SQL Azure or Cosmos DB when you are ready to go to production. There's still much to do to make our application fully functional, but we have covered the basic mechanics. If you're planning to provide an in-application login, you should definitely be sure to one-way encrypt the user's password to protect it. I might add a Part 4 video if people are interested in how to host and protect a single-page application in ASP.NET Core, such as an Angular or React application or even a Blazor app. Leave me a comment if you are interested. Be sure to check out the sample code in GitHub and visit my website at mobiletoaster.com. You can find me on Twitter at mobiletoaster, and feel free to leave me comments or questions at the website, on Twitter, or on YouTube. Once again, thanks for watching.